Hello and welcome. Oh. Yeah, little hiccup at the start there, but I think we're good to go. So hello and welcome to the May 2023 ENSO seminar. I am delighted to be joined by our presenter today, Katsunori Miyahara. Katsunori is a researcher at the Center for Human Nature, Artificial Intelligence and Neuroscience at Hokkaido University, having completed PhD work with both Sean Gallagher and Dan Zahavi, and then gone on to complete postdocs in Harvard with Sean Kelly, and then at Wollongong with Dan Hutto and the crew there. So I'm very excited to have Katsunori join us and discuss his work. So welcome, Katsunori.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, no, so
yes,
delighted to have you on. We've spoken a few times through some of the other ENSO events that happen around the reading groups and so on.
Yeah, shall I share my screen then? Or?
Yeah,
okay,
please, that'd be great, and we can sort of get straight into it without further ado. Around the so we invite you to give the May ENSO seminar on narrative identity and the habituality of the body.
All right. Okay. You see my screen?
Yeah, that's all nice and clear.
All right. All right. Yeah. So yeah, thanks, Mac, for the introduction and moreover for the invitation. So so today I'm going to talk about this paper that's in R&R right now, and hopefully it's going to be published sometime near in the future. So it's about narrative self and the habituality of the body. So first I want to talk about, to explain the general area of the problem I'm exploring in this project. So I think in the literature in theories of the self, there's a kind of general agreement that our sense of self has two prominent aspects, and one being the bodily sense of self, and the other being the narrative sense of self. These are not meant to be comprehensive, so there's going to be likely other dimensions to the sense of self, but these two are the most discussed dimensions of the sense of self. So on the one hand, we typically identify ourselves as an embodied subject tied to a specific body. And this bodily sense of self develops pre-reflectively in our bodily engagement with the world, which means that we don't need to consider which body belongs to us to experience a specific body, your own body as your own. So in this sense, it's different from how we might identify ourselves with a Lego figure when we play with Lego. So in this case, we need to choose one figure and then explicitly declare that this is me. And that's not how we identify ourselves with the body. So this is the bodily dimension of our sense of self. But when we introduce ourselves to other people, we usually don't just show our body and say, this is me. This suggests that our sense of self is not exhausted by the bodily aspect, but it goes beyond that. And rather, we often introduce ourselves by telling a story about our life. So, for example, I might say that, so Marek, you just introduced me by telling my story. So in the same way, I might introduce myself by telling the kind of story that you told about me earlier. So this suggests that we also typically identify ourselves as a subject that persists over time and lives through a story-like sequence of events. And the question I want to explore is that, so it remains unclear how the body and self-narratives, these two dimensions work together to constitute our overall sense of self. Sean Gallagher, in his 2000 paper, pointed to this distinction between two senses of self in terms of the minimal self and the narrative self. So he says that the minimal self refers to a basic sense of self as an immediate subject of experience, unextended in time, that is already present in pre-reflective embodied engagements. So this corresponds to what I call the bodily sense of self. The narrative self, on the other hand, refers to a more developed sense of self as a temporal being, as someone that persists from the past and present to the future. And this is called the narrative self because it is allegedly constituted in the various stories that we and others tell about ourselves. Now, this distinction, I think, is a really nice one that clarifies that the sense of self is multifaceted, but it also remains unclear from this distinction alone. This distinction remains unclear about the relation between these two sources of the sense of self. And in this talk, I will explore this issue by specifically asking how the body contributes to the constitution of the narrative self. So maybe there are different ways to explore this relationship between these two aspects of the sense of self, but I'm going to ask how the body contributes to the narrative self. And in terms of the method, I'm going to draw on phenomenology. I'm going to do some phenomenology of the body and also the practice of self-narrating. And the claim I want to make is that, so it's tempting to think of narrative self-constitution, the process of developing a narrative self-conception through storytelling, as an individual mental act, but it is phenomenologically more plausible to think of it as a more embodied practice. So in other words, I'm going to contrast two conceptions of narrative self-conception, narrative self-constitution, one being a mentalistic conception, which depicts it as a mental process consisting of recollection of episodic memory, and then making sense of it, or making sense of the collection of memories, collection of episodes in terms of a narrative construction, which sees narrative self-constitution as a disembodied, detached, and individual and the mental act. And I want to contrast this with a more embodied conception, which sees it as an embodied and situated and interactive practice. Maybe one thing to note is that no one is explicitly arguing for what I call the mentalistic conception of narrative self-constitution. So it's like a caricature of a view that is that seems to be implicit in some of the discussions in this area, and it's more like a caricature that I want to bring out to clarify what kind of view I want to put forward in this domain. So the outline of the talk is going to be like this. So first, I'm going to give a brief overview of the recent debate on the relation between embodiment and narrativity in the constitution of the self. And then in the second section, I'm going to introduce an account of the nature of the body as in terms of habituality, drawing on Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology. And then in the third section, I'm going to provide an explanation about how the body contributes to the narrative self by drawing on this notion of habit and the habituality of the body. Okay. So when it comes to embodiment and the narrative self, recently there are some attempts to clarify the relationship between embodied and narrative contribution to the sense of self. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the current discussion to give a sense of what the state of art is like and what kind of contribution I want to make in this area. So as I said in the beginning, there's this like broad understanding that there's embodiment and narrative, embodied and narrative dimensions to the self, and that there's a broad like a default understanding that there are two separate aspects. Alan Costa recently challenged the view that the temporally extended sense of self is based exclusively on self-narratives, which is kind of implicit in the literature. He says that narrative is not the only conceivable mode of temporal structuring of experience. Drawing on the phenomenological concept of sedimentation, he then claims that the body also contributes to the development of a temporally extended sense of self. So for him, we each constitute ourselves as a temporal being, both reflectively by making sense of our past experiences through narratives, and also pre-reflectively through a history of bodily engagements with the world. So both the body and narratives contribute to the temporal aspect of the self. And I think he's right, but he doesn't really clarify the relationship between the body and self-narratives. He just says that there are more than narratives to the temporal, to the constitution of the temporal character of the self. Now, Roy Dings is another researcher who explores the relationship between embodiment and narrativity of the self. He says that the body and narratives are in dynamic interplays when constituting the self or self-conceptions. And one way in which they relate to each other is through what he calls narrative self-programming. So subjects or people like us, we can shape our bodily responsiveness to the world based on our narrative self-understandings. So in this way, the body and the narratives are not just independent dimensions, but the narrative can actually shape our body. But he also says that these bodily experiences also affect our narratives by motivating the subject to reconsider their narrative self-conceptions. So one example might be that we might decide to complete an ambitious project in 3 years, and then say to ourselves that now I'm going to wake up at 5 from tomorrow morning so that I can do extra research in the morning to complete this project. And that's like an example of narrative self-programming. When this is successful, you might be able to wake up early in the morning quite easily after a while. But then after a while, instead of that, you might find yourself getting less and less motivated about the project, and then think that maybe I wasn't really committed to the project after all. And that would be a kind of case where the bodily experiences nudged you to reconsider your narrative self-conception. So he says that there's this kind of dynamic interplay between bodily and narrative dimensions of self-understandings. And I think one feature of his account is that while emphasizing the existence of an interplay, he suggests that bodily experiences and self-narratives are first and foremost independent processes. So they are in an interplay, but it seems that they're first established as independent processes. He doesn't say this explicitly, so it's not exactly, he doesn't say this explicitly, but it is suggested from his account. And even if he doesn't agree with this, this kind of view, in any case, he remains silent as to whether and how the body might be involved in the constitution of a narrative self-understanding in the first place. And in this respect, Catriona McKenzie actually already suggested that the body is involved pervasively in narrative self-constitution. So it's not like that they're just in an interplay, but narrative self-constitution is already, in some respect, in some sense, a bodily practice for her. She says, subjectivity is actively constituted against the background of and in relation to the life of the body, which provides the implicit frame of reference for one's sense of self. And I think this is right, but I also think that it needs to be filled in with a more concrete story. It's not exactly clear what she means by saying that the body provides an implicit frame of reference for the sense of self. And I think to give a concrete story, we first need to secure a clearer understanding of the nature of the body. And this leads me to consider the habituality of the body. So, what is a body? And I'm going to draw on Melopontes' account of the body in this section. So, drawing on Merleau-Ponty, there are two tempting conceptions of the body. So we might think that the body as a mere machine, and this is what he calls an empiricist view, or what we might call a mechanist view of the body. And the other tempting conception of the body is what he calls the intellectualist view, or what we might call a mentalist view of the body, which says that the body is nothing but an object of mental representation. So what we call the body is actually the body image that we have in our mind. And he opposes to both these approaches to the body and says that the body actually has something that has a habitual dimension. And moreover, he says that the habitual body grounds a basic, meaningful relationship with the world. And the goal of this section is to clarify what he means by this. And to do that, I want to first focus on the notion of habit. So to clarify what a habit is. And I think this is going to allow us to get a grasp on what he means by saying that, what he means by the habitual body. So as an example of habit, I want to talk about a habit of taking your shoes off. So being a Japanese, this is a very familiar example for myself. So I have a habit of taking my shoes off every time I enter my home or enter someone else's home. And so what does it exactly mean to have this habit? So there are two like easily identifiable features to this. So one is that to say I have this habit is to say that I'm disposed to take my shoes off upon entering home spontaneously, that is without deliberation. So I don't need to think about taking my shoes off. I don't need to think that, oh, so I'm entering my home, so I'm going to take off my shoes to do this, but I just do it spontaneously. It's part of my second nature. And another identifiable feature of saying that I have a habit, this kind of habit, is to say that is that I develop this disposition through repetition. So that is by doing this, so taking my shoes off upon entering my home again and again, every time in the past. So this could be so based on my own will, but it could also be because I was being told to do so by others, say my parents, when I was a child. So in any case, habits. When I have a habit of taking my shoes off, it implies that I developed this by repeating this practice in the past. So one feature of habit is that it exhibits a certain circularity between action. And Claire Carlyle expresses this thought nicely when she says that, I quote, habit can be either a source or a result of actions. We sometimes say that we act out of habit, implying that habit is a cause. We can also recognize that habits are themselves brought into being through the repetition of an action or experience. So there's this kind of circularity between habit and action. But why does repetition lead to habit formation? And this is, we can think of this, we can think that this is because the body is not a mere machine, but it is a material with an inherent tendency to develop habits through its history of engagement with the world. So this I take to be what Merleau-Ponty means when he says that the body has a habitual dimension. And to better understand what he means by this, I want to take a closer look at what habit is. And for that purpose, I want to start with a mechanist view of habit, which I don't endorse, and I don't think Merleau-Ponty endorses either. So in philosophy, and both in philosophy and psychology, habits are often conceptualized as inflexible automatic responses. So for example, psychologist Wendy Wood says that habits are best understood as learned automatic responses with specific features. And the two defining features of habit automaticity are A, activation by recurring context cues, and B, insensitivity to short-term changes in goals, aka not goal-dependent, including changes in the value of response outcomes and the response outcome contingency. So in her view, habits is like an automatic response that is insensitive to goals, which means that sometimes we do something out of habit, even if the outcome of that habitual action is no longer valuable for you. Or sometimes we do something out of habit, even if we know at some level that that habitual action is not going to take you to the goal you were originally intending to achieve. So she says that habits are these insensitive, inflexible automatic responses. Another theorist that that advocates this kind of view of habit is Gilbert Ryle, who says that it is of the essence of merely habitual practices that one performance is a replica of its predecessors. So for him, he draws a very sharp line between habit and skills. So he says that skills are flexible dispositions that allows you to adapt flexibly to various situations. But for him, habits are these like rigid responses, rigid and automatic responses that has no flexibility. But I think this view of habits is not really recommendable. And I want to pose, and I don't think this is how Merleau-Ponty thinks of habits either. And to introduce Merleau-Ponty's take on habits, I want to introduce Merleau-Ponty's view by presenting it as objections to the mechanist view. So one phenomenological objection we can raise to the mechanist view is by pointing to the teleological feature of habits. So habitual actions are not necessarily rigid responses. So rather, habits produce patterned responses to similarly patterned situations by flexibly adjusting the specific course of action. So if we think about the habit of taking your shoes off, it's quite obvious that even if I take my shoes off upon entering my home, like every day, each time I come home, it doesn't mean that I take the specifically same sequence of action to do so, but the specific way I take my shoes off differs widely depending on the specific features of the situation. So in Merleau-Ponty's words, he says that what links elementary movements, reactions, and stimuli together in habit is not an external association. Every mechanical theory runs into the fact that learning process is systematic. The subject does not weld individual movements to individual stimuli, but rather acquires the power of responding with a certain type of solution to a certain form of situation. So he suggests that habits have a certain level of generality and teleology already. Another phenomenological objection that we can raise against the mechanist view is what I call the affectivity objection. So habits do not simply produce behavioral responses. Actually, they also inform the subject's perceptual and affective perspective on the world. So again, to use the same example, the habit of taking your shoes off often involves an affective disposition to find it repulsive to enter home without taking your shoes off. So even if someone allowed you to step into their home without taking your shoes off, we find it repulsive to do so, or maybe at least a bit uneasy to do so. And also, you might find it repulsive to see someone doing that when you have this habit. So having a habit is not just a matter of developing certain behavioral dispositions, but it also shapes the way you view the world in effective terms. Now, I wanted to say that this is how Merleau-Ponty thinks about habits. And I think it is, but I actually couldn't find a quote that straightforwardly supports this reading, which is sad. So I might be wrong. And the reason I thought that this is how Merleau-Ponty understands habit is that he has passages writing that habit is a question of a knowledge in our hands or a knowledge of familiarity. And he says that it involves the ability to identify situations in terms of their typical or familiar physiognomy. And I thought that like these point to the affective dimension of habits. But when I looked back on this passage earlier, it wasn't like exactly clear that he was talking about the affective dimension of the experience. So this suggests that he was thinking that there's a like affective implication of habits, but now I'm a bit unsure. Some people might disagree with that reading. Okay. And so these were the objections to the mechanist view of habits. And another interesting feature of Melopontes' account of habits is that he suggests that habits are also involved in the generation of speech and thought. So he claims that speech is not an external translation of a ready-made thought, but he rather holds that speech accomplishes thought. So it's tempting to think of speech as, think of the relation between thinking and speaking as you develop a thought in your mind, and then you, say, translate that into verbal form when you speak something. But he says that they're much in line with the current like embodied cognition type of thinking. He says that speech is we actually accomplish thought in speech. And he also says, so he expresses the thought by saying that speech is a genuine gesture. So it's a embodied act performed in response to a situation. So it's a gesture, something you do with your body, just like reaching, and like things like reaching is a genuine gesture, something you do with your body in response to a situation. So accordingly, he suggests that language acquisition is not a matter of learning rules to manipulate linguistic symbols, but is more like a form of habit acquisition. It's a matter of developing a habit of responding to certain situations by thinking and speaking, which are not like separate for him. So to summarize all I have said about habits, according to Merleau-Ponty, habits are not just behavioral responses or structures that underpin automatic behavioral responses, but it's something that affects subjective experience globally with respect to not only to motor behavior, but also perception, affective experience, and even thinking and language. So it's something that shapes our perspective, our relationship with the world in a really global manner. And this entails that our subjective perspective on the world, which also constrains the way we are embedded in the world, is ultimately grounded in the body that is characterized by its habituality, by its inherent tendency to develop habits. And I take it that this is probably at least part of what McKenzie means when she says that the life of the body provides the implicit frame of reference for one sense of self. But I haven't talked about how this like subjective bodily perspective, what McKenzie calls the implicit frame of reference, actually links up to one sense of self. So that's going to be the topic of the final section. So habit and narrative self-constitution. So the question is, how does the subjective perspective, which as we saw now that is grounded in the body, how does this contribute to the sense of self, and in particular to the narrative dimension of the self, or the narrative sense of self? And I want to address this question by distinguishing between two aspects of narrative self-constitution. So the first aspect is what I call narrative self-conception, or not only me, but what is called narrative self-conception, which is the conception of the self as a subject with a past, a present, and a future, which is mediated by the practice of telling stories about ourselves. And the second aspect is this very practice of self-narrating. So I want to consider how the body contributes to the sense of narrative self by seeing how the body contributes to each of these two aspects. So first, so how do we develop a narrative self-conception? I think it's, as I saw in the beginning, no one really, as far as I know, advances a clearly articulated view on this issue. But I think it's tempting for many people to adopt a mentalistic view of narrative self-conception, which sees developing a narrative self-conception as an internal mental process where we recollect a disparate set of experiences, episodic memories, and then establish a diachronic link between them in our mind. Probably this is too much of a character. No one would agree with this coarse-grained view, but it's kind of tempting to see it as a mentalistic view, somewhat in line with this. And we can raise a phenomenological objection to this view, which says that we actually typically develop a narrative self-conception as a temporal being, drawing on the temporal continuity of the self that is already implicit in experience, thanks to the existence of habitual patterns of interactions. And it might not be clear why the existence of habitual patterns allows there to be a temporal continuity to be implicit in the experience. And I think this is so because habitual patterns are accompanied by a sense of familiarity. And the sense of familiarity necessarily involves an implicit reference to the past. So this is because we can feel something as familiar only in relation to past experiences that have some similarities with it. So I think it's how can I put it? It's not as clear as I wanted it to be, but so we have a sense of familiarity to certain things we do, like morning routines. When we have a certain morning routine, there's a familiar sequence of events. You wake up, you have a breakfast, you dress, and then you go to school. And then there's a sense of familiarity to it, which is usually a background sense. So you don't really feel it to be familiar, but it's more like you find it unfamiliar when you couldn't really follow that habitual sequence of events. So there's a kind of implicit sense of familiarity to your habitual course through the habitual courses of events, and that means that so nothing feels familiar unless it is similar to something in the past. So the sense of familiarity, that's what I mean by saying that the sense of familiarity necessarily involves an implicit reference to the past. So in this sense, when we have habits, our experience are already connected to the past. And in this sense, there's already an implicit temporal continuity in the experience. And it is typically because of this, because there is this kind of implicit temporal continuity in our experience, that we are motivated to conceive of ourselves as a temporal being in making self-narratives. And this, I think, challenges the mentalistic view, which sees the temporal continuity as something that is constructed in self-narratives alone. Okay, so that was one aspect of how the body contributes to narrative self-conception. And then the second aspect is the practice of self-narrating. So again, if we think of what self-narrating is, it is tempting, it might be tempting for some people to adopt a mentalistic view, according to which self-narrating is an internal and individual process consisting of recollecting the past and making sense of the past episodes in terms of a story, narrative interpretation, and linguistic expression. But again, this view is phenomenologically suspect. So one might say that self-narration is not necessarily an individual mental act, but it also can be an embodied and situated practice. So for example, you might visit a park with your family and talk about other times you came here in the past. I think this is a very common way in which we weave narratives about ourselves. And in this case, just like other speech acts, self-narrating is a genuine gesture in Melopontes' terminology. It's something we do with the body in response to a situation. But this is not to say that there are not differences between speech acts and self-narratives. So one difference is that self-narration draws on a special kind of linguistic habit. In self-narrating interactions, we talk about the past because talking about a shared memory is a pattern of behavior we have developed through a history of social interactions. So this suggests that situated self-narration is something based on what one might call narrative habits. That is a specific kind of linguistic habit that involves responding to situations by talking and thinking about relevant past. So we might think of self-narrating as a special kind of speech that draws on a special kind of linguistic habit. And self-narration also has a unique relationship with the act of recollection. And there's a kind of a circular entanglement, I think. So recollection often invites self-narrating, and self-narrating often invites further recollection. So it's natural. I think the first part of this pair is quite natural. So we might think that when we recollect the past, and if you have someone to talk to, or if you're in a mode of like if you're reflecting and writing about what you did in the past year or something, the act of recollection, and when you have a memory, it invites you to talk about it or write about it. So it invites self-narrating. But also, especially in conversations, when I tell a story about yourself, the specific act of speech often invites further recollection. So when you visit a park and then say with your family, and then you talk about the last time you visited the park, that speech often like arouses like further it like I say, it brings in like further memory about the day. And then say you might talk about the park, and then you might talk about how you visited a bar after the park, saying that this isn't possible now because we have a child, something like that. So this act of talking itself often invites further recollection. And then when you have further recollection, it often invites further self-narrating. So in this sense, self-narratives are different from like any like other kinds of speech acts in that they develop dynamically over time, driven by this kind of co-evolution between recollection and self-narration. So if we think about how the body grounds self-narrating, I think we can start to outline an embodied view of self-narration, which sees self-narrating as an embodied practice situated in the spatial and temporal unfolding of experience. And this is so. Self-narrating is such an embodied practice because we are embodied creatures who have cultivated narrative habits through our history of social interactions. So in this sense, narrative self-constitution is not just a mentalistic practice, but it's something that is grounded in the habituality of the body. So this might be another way we can think about the relationship between the body and self-narratives. Okay, so that's basically all. And to summarize what I've been saying, so the basic question I've been exploring is how the body contributes to the narrative self. And then drawing on Merleau-Ponty, I kind of assumed the view that the body has an inherent tendency to cultivate habits that shape our general relationship with the world. And I assumed it, but I assumed it, I think, with reason. And then based on this conception of the body, I made two claims about how narrative self-constitution is grounded in the habituality of the body, or grounded in the body characterized by this habitual nature. And one is that some narrative self-conceptions are constrained and informed by habitual patterns of interactions, which are often accompanied by the sense of familiarity. And the second way is that self-narrating is itself an embodied practice involving narrative habits. So that's it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Katsunori. There's loads there, and I have a few different things I'd like to get into in follow-up, although I kind of holding myself back in some aspects as well. We've a couple of questions come in on the chat too, which I'll relay in. I mean, I guess we might start actually, because one of these is quite broad, and that is how it's phrased in the chat here is from my online graveyard, possibly an Irish connection, I'm not entirely sure. So how is a concept different from a story? So I guess we talk about this narrative self-concept, but I guess are there any concepts that aren't narratives in some sense, that there's the phrase is being used there, and is there a sort of a particular discipline behind it that we need to keep in mind?
How? So I'm not sure exactly.
Yeah, no, it is a rather broad one to start with. So
I do think there are concepts that are not necessarily tied to narratives, like the numbers. The concept 3 doesn't need to be situated in a narrative to make sense. Yeah. But I don't know if that's
Yeah. Okay. So is there, I guess, what is there that's making that difference then? So I get, crucially, it's
Yep.
this is going to be one of the key differences between our self-concept and other kinds of concepts, is that the self-concept is bound into the notion of narrative, whereas other concepts don't seem to have that dependence on narrative. And so what is it about the self that drags the narrative with it?
Yeah. So I think so. One thing is that I don't think that self-conceptions necessarily requires a narrative, and I think that's why I think that's one point of saying that the self is a multifaceted phenomenon. So there are like dementia. If you have dementia, you might eventually lose the narrative aspect of yourself. And people often say that like my grandma's no longer there, like she's a different person or something like that. But that doesn't mean that a person with dementia is in a no self, is in a state of no self, or has lost any aspect of a self. They usually have retained their embodied sense of self, so they might know that which hand is your hand. For example, they might, if someone tries to hit you, they might like withdraw your hand. So I don't think the sense of self necessarily requires a narrative, but I think it's the typical way in which we make sense of ourselves. And I think that's how we should understand the place of narratives in the self.
Yeah, that connects to a question I'm very keen to get into, because it's, I guess, implicitly from what you were saying there, we have, we can talk, as you said, there's at least two and probably more facets to self. And we have a bodily or embodied sense of self, and then this narrative self, which is brought into being through the habitual interaction with others from your descriptions, right? So because it's linguistic and has this linguistic character. But in fact, through the descriptions that you provided, the others were substantially implicit. They were very present in the background, but aren't brought out. So, for example, in the three key aspects of habit that you'd identify, you'd talk about teleology, affect, and linguistic habits. And I guess they're present there a little bit in the linguistic, but they're also present in the teleological and the affective. For example, in the case of removing your shoes, this is a practice in a culture, in a society, and it is looked upon in certain ways, and it is expected, and it is ingrained in raising children. And so there is a substantial social and cultural facet to maintaining a habit that is, I guess, that you don't bring up as an explicit aspect of habits. And so I guess there's in particular, I guess one of the things that it makes this so salient to me is Iris Marion Young's criticism of Merleau-Ponty's conception of the body, because Merleau-Ponty's conception doesn't include that. And in obviously Young's particular focus is on the ways in which women bodies are constrained, and the kinds of habits that women are encouraged and facilitated to develop are very different to those of men, and then other genders now, as we see. So there's a facet to habit maybe there that we haven't teased out explicitly yet.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah. So in this paper, and also I think in this like a small domain of, like, in this small debate about the self, I think so this domain was quite framed by like Sean Gallagher's paper on like, I think it was titled Two Senses of Self, or maybe something like that. Anyway, so he contrasted these two aspects of the self, And I think the debate was framed by that, and I think I've inherited that, which which kind of made me take maybe a narrow approach, just focusing on these two aspects. But I think you're totally right to say that, narratives are embedded in these social cultural environments, and it's actually really hard to tease out the more individual aspect. That's what I try to do, to make it sure that I can contrast these embodied or actually tie together these embodied and narrative aspects. But I have nothing to disagree with you on that. Yeah.
I mean, it strikes me as something that I don't know. You've probably heard from previous conversations. You probably heard me talk about this before. But one of the interesting characteristics that seemed to strike me about the way Wendy Wood described habit versus yourself and Merleau-Ponty and others is, for Wood, and I guess that kind of implicit notion of, and Ryle to a certain extent as well, of this very specific, almost robotic, automatic enacting of a particular set of movements or behaviors, is a description that can only be accurate at a particular resolution of description, and that is at the level of bodily movements. Whereas what Merleau-Ponty and yourself make out, or sort of make clear, is that habits are not just a phenomenon of that grain of resolution, that they're a phenomenon that occurs at this broader grain. So, to take off my shoes as I step inside a house is not to move my legs in a particular way. It's to effectively move my shoes from the ground on the outside to the appropriate place just inside the door, where the separation between the ground outside and the ground inside is maintained effectively. And similarly through some of the other examples that you were talking about. So there's a sort of an interesting tension then between what is the appropriate level of description of the phenomenon habit, and it seems to be where there is some of this disagreement. It's at that, it's one of the things that underlies it.
That's a great point. That's a great point. It's a great question. Again, I have nothing to disagree, and that's true. I wrote a paper a few years ago with Ian Robertson about challenging these more mechanist views of habits. But we kind of assumed a different. We kind of assumed that it's more appropriate to work on this rather, a more global perspective on habitual practices. But we didn't address why we're supposed to take that kind of, a more holistic view. I need to think about it. It's a great question. Thanks.
It's tempting to see a difference in just the training of psychologists and what psychologists care about, and the training of philosophers and what philosophers care about. But I did love your descriptions, particularly in the later section when you're talking about the practice of self-narrative as this shared practice. Is this something that's just implicit in the way we talk about our experiences? Going to the park, contrasting, in some ways, helping us perceive the park we're in more clearly by contrasting it and comparing it with our previous experiences of the same park. And it also helps us see our lives by comparing and contrasting our current experience with our previous experience, and that the narrative essentially develops implicitly within that practice. But the sharedness of it, and this is it somewhat relates to another comment just from YouTube there, which is just the point of redescribing what's already known. But is this just how social the supposedly individual self is? Is a really interesting implication, I think, of the kind of practice that you're describing there, and how different it is when you describe it as an embodied practice versus how less salient that becomes if we think of it as an individualistic one.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's this social aspect of the self-narrating and also the narrative self is something I think something I want to articulate more clearly. And I think there's several dimensions to it. And I think one common way to think about the social aspect of the narrative self is to say that, so in a narrative, we often consider ourselves as someone occupying the social role. And I think that's one thing. But I think there's a slightly different aspect to the sociality of the narrative self, which is how the way we narrate and how this practice of narrating is also embedded in the social context, and not only triggered by the social situation, which is like you have a friend nearby, so you're triggered to talk about yourself, but also the way you describe your narrative. It seems to me it's really social, culturally. I think the material content of the narrative or the form of the narrative is deeply shaped by the social context, which I find it really hard to articulate.
I mean, is that what Merleau-Ponty means when he uses the phrase genuine gesture? So it seemed to be that the notion of a genuine gesture was something that is specifically contextualized to this particular ongoing event, rather than something else. That's again, it seems that the details of this current environment mattered to the action in the case of a genuine gesture versus something else. Is that what he means? Is that the kind of?
Yeah. So I think so. I should have added a quote from him to be certain, but I think so. I think that's what he means. So yeah, a more like stereotypical embodied gesture, embodied action is shaped not only by your like individual internal features, but also by the situation of the environment, the shape of your cup, for example, to give a really trivial case. And yeah, it is similarly in a very coarse-grained way. Yeah, speaking is an embodied gesture. Yeah, I think that's what he means. But now you said it, I feel like I need to looking the text carefully to.
Well, I guess when you described it, particularly in the frame of self-narrative as a linguistic habit, it sort of struck me as you say, we have this tendency to introduce ourselves by telling a story, but we edit the story appropriately for the immediate present, right? So it's a genuine gesture in the sense that it is relevant to what I'm doing now rather than relevant to something else. Seem like it's a genuine engagement with what's happening rather than a robotic recapitulation. So, for example, when I introduced you, on the basis of the information on your website, I have your professional biography, but I also had your personal, you enjoy rugby and sort of various other aspects of your personal life, which, while very variously appealing, maybe are not relevant to the. So I paused briefly as to whether to include those aspects of your biography in your introduction, because this is the ENSO seminars. Ultimately, I decided I was genuinely on the fence about it, but ultimately decided to leave them out clearly. But that sort of continuous editing process, as we might call it, that seems to be partly what's being captured in that notion of genuine gesture, that it's not just any old self, and it's rarely the same self we produce, we produce a self that's in response to a gesture towards the environment we're with.
Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah.
Well, that's wonderful. Katsunori, the time has flown, for me at least, but we have reached the end of our session. So I will say thank you very much for sharing your work and giving your time to the seminars.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
Very grateful for it. And we'll finish there, and we will hopefully see everyone on YouTube and elsewhere for another ENSO seminar.
All right.